people do you have worshiping here on an average Sunday?
So we usually have about 100 in Church.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then 40, 50 kids downstairs.
Okay. Yeah.
Pretty good size. Yeah, it's starting to actually kind of fill up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Test. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening to hear our lecture here. It's my privilege to introduce a friend of mine. I've known Dr. Mark Hall for a decade or so now, and we actually started working on a project together a couple years ago on religious liberty in the states. It's an index that we put together and track annually about state protections of religious liberty. So I've known Mark for 10 years, or give or take a couple, and then we've been working together closely for a couple years. It's really an honor and a treat to have him here. So Mark taught at George Fox University for a long time out in Oregon. He still is affiliated with them. But then he also started teaching at the Regent Law School out in Virginia a few years ago. And so he kind of splits his time, goes back and forth to some online stuff. And of course, what's also interesting is he does a lot of travel and a lot of testifying in court cases as an expert witness around religious liberty. So the case about 10 Commandments, is it okay to have the statue or the 10 Commandments out in front of the courthouse, right? Is that a violation of church-state separation? Mark is a witness in that case, or cases like that. And so he's an expert in this. He's passionate about it. He's done a lot. He's written quite a few books. He's written about Christian nationalism, about the founders. So it really is an honor and a treat to have him here. So he's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions, anything you want to ask him afterwards. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mark to talk to us about the American founding.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Paul, did you say 25 or 45? 45. Okay, good. I thought my time was being cut in half. All right. Well, it's been great knowing Paul and getting to know his family a little bit, and he's told me about the Abbey and Leadville for many years. And so it's great. I jumped at the chance to come up for this talk, and then we're having a little intellectual conference over there in the next couple of days, and I'm really looking forward to this. So what I'm going to do tonight is address a question. I addressed it in a book of the same title, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And it's fine if you aren't familiar with this question, but a lot of ink has been spilt about it. There are popular Christian authors who go to one extreme, and they say, of course, America had a Christian founding. All the founders were godly. Maybe they were even evangelical Christians. They would certainly worship in evangelical mega churches if they were with us today, and they consciously attempted to create a Christian nation. Now, there's a lot more truth to this than falsehood, but it is a problematic, well, this is not advancing. I turned it on. You get, all right, yeah, okay, uh-oh. Huh. It advanced and then unadvanced. All right. I'm not sure. We'll see. Next slide. So I'm actually not concerned with these popular Christian authors, in part because they get more right than they get wrong, and in other part because they've been criticized by some Christian historians and whatnot. And I know some of them, and I like them, and so I'm just going to leave them alone for the purposes of this talk. What I think is far more important is within the academy, you have scholar after scholar at major universities writing books like the ones behind me. And these people are in the most prominent law schools at Ivy League universities, at Christian colleges. And they write books and articles arguing that, of course, America did not have a Christian founding. Most of the founders were deists. Maybe they weren't even deists. Maybe they were atheists. They set out to create a godless constitution, and they wanted to strictly separate church and state. So I think this is wrong as a matter of history, but it also has important consequences when it comes to church-state relations. I'll just mention briefly, I was a witness for the Becket Fund for a case in Minnesota Minnesota will pay for high school students to go to colleges. They'll even pay for them to go to private colleges, but they decided in their wisdom that they wouldn't pay for them to go to Christian colleges if the Christian college required a statement of faith. And, so you got these people out there who want to have a secular public school era, remove 10 Commandments. And so this is a sort of problem, one of the problems I hope to address in this book and through similar arguments. All right, so did we go? All right, there we go. So what I want to do, it's always fun to attempt to define your terms. And so what I want to do is begin by asking the question, what would a Christian founding look like, with emphasis on the founding, okay? How do we know a Christian founding if we saw it? And I want to talk about a couple of possibilities, which I'll raise and then reject, and then I'll get to what I understand a Christian founding to be. So one possibility is we simply mean Americans in the late 18th century were Christians, or they would have identified themselves as Christians. And if this is what we mean, then indisputably America had a Christian founding. If Americans of European descent, about 98% are Protestant as late as the late 18th century, 2% Roman Catholic, and you have maybe 1,500 Jews in 4 American cities. So overwhelmingly, they would have identified as Protestant, but I don't find that very interesting. They might have been heterodox Christians, heterodox Protestants. They might have been Protestants who self-consciously wanted to create a secular republic. So I want to go beyond that. It would be a lot more interesting to argue that America's founders were all Orthodox Christians. That is, they would affirm the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. But it's basically impossible to get at this question. We can know oftentimes the denominational affiliation of a founder, maybe if he went to church, but how are we to judge his heart? And very few of them left a sort of paper trail that would give us a good indication of the interior of their mind. So that wouldn't be a bad way to approach it, but I think it's difficult for the historian to approach. One possibility, Christian historians really kind of like this possibility, is they want to say, well, did the founders act like Christians? And then they often make silly arguments. Alexander Hamilton had an extramarital affair, and Christians shouldn't have extramarital affairs. And I most certainly agree with that. Absolutely, we should not. But I will remind you that if the test of being a Christian is moral perfection, then none of us are Christians, right? And an extramarital affair is really, really bad. But still, we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. So I'm not sure this is particularly profitable. So the way I go about asking or attempting to answer the question, did America have a Christian founding, is by looking at influence. And here I'm in good company, because you would not believe how many scholars have written books saying that the America's founders were influenced by Lockean liberalism, or the classical Republican tradition, or the Scottish School of Moral Sense. And so I want to argue, well, can we show that they were influenced in important ways by Christian ideas? And I think we can. And I think we can even admit there's different influences at work, but the dominant influence, I'll contend, is Christianity. All right, so what does Christian founding look like? Here we go. I want to turn to when was America founded. And this, I think, oftentimes when we say the founding, people immediately think late 18th century. I think you could make a good case for the early colonial settlements. These Europeans, mostly from Britain, came over. They settled in the colonies. Right away, they started governing themselves in every respect, politically, ecclesiastically, in church governance, passing laws influenced by Christianity. If you go to the early Massachusetts Bay Codes, you'll see laws with scriptural references showing why these are legitimate laws. They're attempting to create a shining city on the hill. And really almost no one would argue with me when it comes to New England. But what people sometimes say is, well, yeah, fine, New England was about God, but the South was about gold. And it kind of was, but on the other hand, New England was too. When people came to America, they were often looking for economic opportunity as well as the ability to practice their faith. But let me read you something from Virginia's 1610 legal code. It begins like this: whereas his majesty, like himself, a most zealous prince, hath in his own realms a principal care of true religion and reverence in God, and has always commanded his generals and governors with all his forces whatsoever to let their ways be like their ends for the glory of God. This is colonial Virginia. And colonial Virginia goes on to require church attendance daily, to say that blasphemy will be punished by death. Now, I don't think these are good things. I don't think we should have laws like that, let me be clear, but I'm just trying to emphasize that even in Virginia, they cared greatly about the things of God. Now, if you go to the Mid-Atlantic colony, I taught at George Fox for many years. George Fox is a school in the Quaker tradition. Pennsylvania was founded as a haven for Quakers, and it's oftentimes called a wonderful seedbed of religious liberty. And there was more religious liberty. There are differences between the colonies, so don't think I'm saying that they're all the same. But I used to love showing my Quaker friends Article 37 of Pennsylvania's charter. So this article says, it begins by saying, it begins by listing offenses against God, and it says clearly these offenses should be punished by the magistrate. And these include swearing, cursing, lying, profane talking, drunkenness, obscene words, incest, sodomy. So that's a lot of bad stuff, but we go on. All prizes, stage plays, cards, dice, May games, gamesters, masks, revels, bull baiting, cockfighting, bear baiting, and the like, which excite the people to rudeness, cruelty, looseness, and irreligion. So Quaker Pennsylvania, the magistrate should be intimately involved with encouraging virtue, punishing vice. Like every colony, there's a religious test for office. You had to be a theist who affirmed the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament. And again, it's kind of an interesting thing. And yet there was still a fine religious liberty provision. And so these things were held together. You could have religious liberty even as you had the government encouraging Christian virtue in punishing vice and religious tests for office. So I think if you started the early colonies, it's an easy case. America indisputably had a Christian founding. Now, it gets a little more difficult, perhaps, when we get to the War for American Independence. And if we focus in on 1776, we're just about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And yet one could argue, wait a minute, doesn't the War for American Independence fly in the face of Romans 13, which I'll remind you begins, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and authorities that exist are appointed by God. And so historically, most Christians have taken this to be no revolution. If the ruler tells you to bow down and worship Baal, you say no, but that's it. You don't overthrow him. However, those reformers, those pesky reformers, Luther, but then especially Calvin and the followers of John Calvin, they went in a very different direction because, you know, these reformers, they read their Bible all the way through. They kept reading in Romans 13, and if you get down to verse 4 and 5, it says things like, and rulers will punish those who do wickedness and reward those who do good. And they started thinking, okay, now what happens if you have a ruler who is routinely punishing good people, attempting to stomp out Protestantism, for instance, or routinely rewarding bad people? That would seem not to be what Romans 13, 1 and 2 is talking about. So they would distinguish between a ruler and a tyrant. A ruler's legitimate. A ruler might make mistakes. We might not like the level of taxation of the ruler, but generally we obey and defer to the ruler. But when the ruler becomes a tyrant, there's the possibility of resisting him. Now, John Calvin is actually among the more conservative of all these guys. In the last edition of his Institutes, he says that inferior magistrates may resist a superior magistrate who becomes tyrannical. Okay, so he's worried about those people. We don't trust the people, but an inferior magistrate. So if you have, say, the Holy Roman Emperor and the minor lords under him, and then the hoi polloi under them, if the emperor were to become tyrannical, the lords could lead resistance, but never private people, as he would put it. But even as he's writing that last edition, you have John Knox up in Calvin saying, no, the people themselves may resist a tyrant. Now, he would prefer that inferior magistrates lead this resistance, but the people themselves may do that. Now, this is very important in the American context. I already suggested what a Protestant people we were. In late 18th century America, between 50 and 75% of Americans are reasonably classified as Calvinists. And so they grow up with this sort of teaching. This is a part of their worldview, I think it's fair to say. This was incidentally noticed by the opposition. King George III called the Patriots, the Patriot resistance, the Presbyterian Rebellion. And a loyalist is complaining about the black regiment, the dissenting clergy, the black regiment. What does this mean in this context? Dissenting clergy, believe it or not, means non-Anglican clergy. About 15% of Americans are Anglicans, that is, members of the Church of England. 50 to 75% are Calvinists, so these Presbyterians, these Congregationalists. They're considered dissenters, even though they're in a majority, but because they aren't following the mother church. And this guy recognizes these are the leaders. There is almost no Calvinist clergy of any denomination that remained a loyalist. Almost all of them were encouraging of the patriot cause, whereas about 50% of Church of England ministers remained loyalists. All right, let me suggest as well, if we go to this document that we're going to celebrate next year, the the central claim of the document is a profoundly theological claim, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I forgot about this little slide. Let me mention it briefly. There's a fear that the Church of England is going to send a bishop to North America to clean house, to clamp down on these dissenters. And there are pamphlet wars going back and forth. The image here is a bishop has been sent, but Americans are meeting him at the shore, throwing books at him. The one about to hit the bishop in the head, you can't really read it, but it says Calvin's Works. It just emphasizes his reformed commitment to liberty, I think. Declaration of Independence. Now, you could argue that Thomas Jefferson is not a Christian, and you would be right. He's not an Orthodox Christian. There's no question about that. But later in life, he said, look, the Declaration of Independence was not original. I was harmonizing the sentiments of the time. And if you look beyond Jefferson, there's a committee of 5 that included Roger Sherman, the Latter-day Puritan that we'll meet later. But it included lots of people, probably 50 to 75% are Calvinists. And this document, the Declaration, is a product of a community. It was changed in ways that Jefferson did not like by the Committee of 5. It was changed further by the Continental Congress. It became an authoritative document because of the Continental Congress. So I would suggest we cannot read this document in light of the interior of Jefferson's mind. We have to look at it as a product of a community. All right, well, let me move on then. So I think an excellent argument can be made that the War for American Independence and the Declaration are easily justifiable in light of Christian theology in the Bible. You move on to the Constitution, though, and maybe we have a problem. The Godless Constitution, that's the title of a book, the book one there, by Isaac Cramnick and R. Lawrence Moore, 2 very prominent professors at Cornell, and they have a book-length book, I guess it kind of makes sense, right? A book arguing that we have a godless constitution. Now, one of the things they observe, which is pretty simplistic, is that the deity is not mentioned in the Constitution until we get to the date line, in the year of our Lord, 1787. There's some sense that America is a Christian country. For instance, after Congress passes a bill, the president has 10 days to sign it, Sundays accepted, right? That's in the Constitution. There's an assumption that that Congress will not be doing business on the Lord's Day, and Congress almost never did, and almost still never does, for that matter. I think maybe once in the 18th century, Congress met on Sunday for an emergency. But arguably, this kind of nod toward Christianity would be at least countered by Article 6's prohibition on religious tests for office. This really was interesting and unusual. So Article 6 says you can't have a religious test for federal office. Now, in 1787, something like 12 of the 13 states, I think it's 11 of the 13 states, had religious tests for office, and then New York added one a couple years later, bringing it up to 12. So religious tests are still common, but not in the U.S. Constitution. Now, I just don't think you can that it matters that much how many references to the deity you have. And one way I can show this is when you look at these folks that want to find a secularist founding, and you say, look at the Declaration of Independence. There's nature's God, there's creator, there's providence. They say, oh, that stuff doesn't count. That's all just rhetoric. It's window dressing. And so even if there are 50 references to God in the Constitution, that's what they would say, right? It's just window dressing. It doesn't matter. But I almost don't care how many references to God there are aren't, because remember how I'm defining Christian founding. It's terms of influence. And I'll give you 4 ways in which I think the Constitution was clearly influenced by Christian ideas. But let me mention first a study that was done 40 years ago, published in my discipline's premier journal, the American Political Science Review. A guy named Donald Lutz went back, and he looked at the political literature of the American founding, and he looked at a large number and then brought it down to a subset, and then he went through carefully and he looked at what are the founders citing when they're making political arguments. So that's important. This is political literature. This isn't sermons were published all the time, and he's not looking at sermons on salvation or Revelation or things like that. Political literature, right? He's not looking at self-help manuals. There's lots of stuff, almanacs that are published. The political literature. When he looked at the political literature, he finds that 34% of all citations are to the Bible. 22% are to all Enlightenment texts combined. So Locke, Montesquieu, Beccari, Adam Smith, all combined, 22%. The Bible, 34%. And I want to suggest he profoundly undercounts references to Scripture, because he tells us, I'm not going to look at political sermons unless they also have secular citations. But just like today, just like you're preaching in this church, there's probably lots of times where whomever's preaching only references the Bible and maybe a Christian thinker or two, but probably not very often a John Locke or something like that, right? So if you looked at political sermons, the number would expand. And also, and I'll give you examples of this later, all the time America's founders are alluding to Scripture, are quoting Scripture without the citation. So by citation, I literally mean the little parenthetical Micah 4:4. And I don't pick that Scripture by accident. That was one of George Washington's favorite Bible verses. He references it more than 40 times throughout his writings, and yet to my knowledge, he never puts Micah 4:4 after it. So Mr. Lutz would not have counted that at all. All right, but let's press on to ways in which America's founders were influenced by Christianity when they created our constitutional order. The French Revolution, no, that's not us. Why is it not us? Because the founders were convinced that humans are sinful. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. And so they said, look, we need to limit power. We need to limit the power of this national government very severely. Article 1, Section 8, enumerations, separation of powers, checks and balances. There's all sorts of ways in which the national government is attempting to prevent concentrated power. The French Revolution went in the opposite direction because the leaders of the French Revolution had the idea that humans are perfectible, just like all utopian thinkers do, right? Karl Marx, if we just get the economic system right, all will be well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Plato, if we get the educational system right, all will be well, because humans are perfectible. No, and the French revolutionaries did not accept this idea that humans are sinful, and so that ended in a bloodbath. This is pretty obvious, but I'll give you some cool examples. They believed in moral standards, that God has created moral standards that we must always defer to. My favorite way of illustrating this is if you look at James Wilson, a signer of the Declaration, an author of the Constitution, an early Supreme Court justice. He gives a series of law lectures at the College of Philadelphia, and when he discusses the nature of law, you would think you are reading St. Thomas Aquinas. He makes distinctions like this. There are 2 types of law, divine law and human law. Of the divine law, there are 4 types. The eternal law, the celestial law, natural physical laws, and natural moral laws. Human laws must be based upon natural moral laws. An unjust law is no law at all, he says, paraphrasing St. Augustine and Aquinas. And so there's a recognition of morality. And this is real important as well, and Americans really went astray with this in the mid-20th century. Their understanding of liberty was a very constrained understanding of liberty. Liberty is a freedom, the ability to do what is right. If you were to go back and talk to the founders, even in Thomas Jefferson, and say, oh, freedom of press gives me the right to publish pornography, right? They would look at you like you were crazy, or to curse in public, or to burn the American flag as a form of political speech. No. Again, if I can quote Wilson, law without liberty is tyranny. Liberty without law is licentiousness. That's a distinction we don't make as a matter of law anymore, right? Between liberty and license, but you don't have a right to do what is wrong. Finally, I'll point out, and this is an area that Americans are moving towards in a very powerful way, the idea that we're all created in the imago Dei, the image of God, and therefore should be treated with respect and dignity. If I'm quoting James Wilson a lot, it's because my first book was on him and he gives some great examples. I could give other examples, but listen to this from a U.S. Supreme Court opinion. Chisholm versus Georgia, Justice Wilson observes this: man fearfully and wonderfully made is a workmanship of his all-perfect creator. Does that sound familiar, even if you haven't read Wilson? Yeah, Psalm 139. But guess what? Wilson doesn't put Psalm 139:1 after it, so Donald Lutz would have missed this sort of reference. The founders did this sort of thing all the time. He went on to talk about the implications of the imago Dei. He writes that with a consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. In the contemplation of the law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb. By the law, his life is protected not only from immediate destruction, but from every degree of actual violence. Now, this is a common law standard. They did not know what we know about fetal development. I think if Wilson knew what we knew, he would say from conception to its natural end, life is protected. He does address suicide. He asks the question, is there a right to suicide? And he says, no. It's not your life, right? It's God's life, so you have no right to take it. All right, so there's a whole host of ways in which the founders were influenced by Christian ideas when they created our constitutional order at the national level, but also at the state level. Let me turn to a very practical application. I thought I had a picture of two justices. I don't, but I'll tell you what they argued. In 1947, there was a case, Everson versus the Board of Education. This is a case that applied the Establishment Clause to the First Amendment to the states. What's important for our purposes, though, Wiley Rutledge for the majority and Hugo Black for the dissent, they disagreed on how the case should be decided, but they both agreed with this syllogism. We must interpret the Establishment Clause in light of the founders' views. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison equal the American founders. Jefferson and Madison wanted a strict separation between church and state, a wall of separation between church and state. Therefore, the Establishment Clause requires a wall of separation between church and state. Now, believe it or not, both Rutledge and Black are progressives. They are very, very progressive justices, and yet here they are making originalist arguments, which is kind of interesting. I'm an originalist, but these are very bad arguments. And so I want to do, to close us in our practical time, then we can talk about these things and have Q&A, is I want to look at three areas of consensus that I think you can find with respect to religious liberty and church-state relations in the American founding. And let me be clear about what's going on. There's some very disingenuous people who will sometimes say, well, not all the founders agreed on everything, therefore you can't do originalism. That's just silly. Obviously, there was disagreement. You all know, of course, after the Constitution was proposed, there was a big argument about it. You had the Federalists saying we should ratify this thing. You have the Anti-Federalists saying we shouldn't ratify it. So we can recognize there were Americans who did not want the U.S. Constitution. But guess what? They lost. We ratified the Constitution, and so life went on, and some of these Anti-Federalists went on to serve in the U.S. Congress, right? That's kind of how democracy works. We come together, we argue, we vote, and then we continue on in the system and work within the system. So there are differences, obviously, but there are areas of consensus. The strongest area of consensus is what the founders, with what the founders called the sacred right of conscience, religious liberty. We really didn't have religious liberty in early America. Some colonies banned altogether Quakers and Catholics. There certainly were established churches. Dissenters were punished. Heresy was punishable in some colonies and this sort of thing. But things develop, and they develop largely for Christian reasons, I think. Christians like Roger Williams and William Penn, Isaac Backus, Elisha Williams, making arguments from the Christian tradition for religious liberty. By the time we get to the founding era, there's this broad consensus that religious liberty must be robustly protected. There it is. All right. Well, anyway, here we have a great illustration of this is George Mason. He is asked in 1776 to come up with a religious liberty provision for Virginia. Virginia is revising all its laws, constitution. They're going to have a Bill of Rights. And he writes a religious liberty provision. Listen to how his reads. That as religion or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. I want to note two things. First of all, note that this is an argument. We have a duty to God, and therefore we must be free to exercise this duty. So this argument for religious liberty is grounded on a theological proposition. I wanted you to notice that, but then notice that language as well, the toleration of religion. Young James Madison, in his first public act, stood up and objected. He said, I don't like that language of toleration. That makes it seem like we're just going to kind of put up with you for now, maybe, if you're a dissenter. And he proposed instead that we exchange that language for language to make it clear that there's a natural right to the free exercise of religion. That is a right grounded in nature and nature's God, not something given to us by men. And notice, for the free exercise of religion. We have recently had some presidents who want to change the wording of the First Amendment. The First Amendment, as we eventually get it, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Some recent presidents, I won't name them, but they like talking about the freedom of worship. You Baptists can come into this building and do whatever you want on Sunday morning. You can worship God however you want, and you certainly have that right, but that is a very limited right. How would that right help Jack Phillips, a cake baker, who wants to run his business to the glory of God, or to the street preacher who wants to go to the public square and share the gospel? People who want to exercise their faith in areas other than church. I think the free exercise clause clearly protects that. This change is evident of it. Every state adopts religious liberty protections, and we could go into this in much greater detail, but I think it's clearly the case that if we go by the original understanding of the free exercise clause, that it protects a very robust ability to act upon your religious convictions whenever possible. Now, obviously, there has to be a limiting principle. We aren't going to allow the sun worshiper to sacrifice a baby to sun god. The court has developed in the past, I think, very reasonable limiting principles that permit all Americans to act on their religious convictions in all sorts of manners, but not allow for human sacrifice, among other things. But let me press on, because one thing people might point out is, well, Hall, wait a minute. We know that 9 of the 13 colonies had established religions, but they're moving away from establishments. They're getting rid of establishments. So isn't this evidence that they're moving away from Christianity? Here I would say no. I had a real fun time a few years ago going through petitions received in the Virginia General Assembly. Basically, the Anglican Church was established in Virginia. During the War for American Independence, the government got out of the business of collecting taxes to support the church. It had other things to do. There are now a lot of Baptists and Presbyterians in Virginia who don't want to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. And so the General Assembly said, okay, fine, we won't tax you to support the Anglican Church. But then finally they said, okay, let's just get done with this altogether. We aren't going to get involved in this stuff. Now, this really bothered Patrick Henry. He said, wait a minute, religion is really important. And if something's really important, the government should support it. And so he came up with a kind of innovative way that people could be taxed to support religion without having to violate their conscience. He said, look, people will be taxed to support the church they choose to attend. So you Baptists who choose to attend this church will be taxed to support this church. The Catholics who attend that church over there will be taxed to support the Catholic Church, and so forth, right? So it's called a multiple or plural establishment. Who can object? Well, people did object. Among others, these evangelicals from Westmoreland County. One of the arguments is incidentally, literally people made this argument. We want Christianity to flourish, so we need good ministers. If we want the best young men to go into the ministry, we have to pay them well. If we don't, they'll go off and become lawyers or doctors or merchants or something like that, right? So we need to pay them well. This is incidentally the sort of argument often made by public sector unions today. We want the best and brightest to go into A, B, or C, so we have to pay them well. These evangelicals said, no, sir. We want ministers to manifest to the world that they are moved inwardly let me read it from here, so I'm looking at you. Manifest to the world that they are inwardly moved by the Holy Ghost, that they take upon to take that office, that they seek the good of mankind and not worldly interest. Let their doctrines be scriptural and their lives upright. Then shall religion, if departed, speedily return, and deism be put to open shame and its dreaded consequences removed. And they go on to argue, look, Christianity was far more pure before Constantine established it by law. So the argument is, look, we don't want men motivated by money to become ministers. We want them to be motivated by the Holy Ghost. And if we rely on God, the church will be far more pure. So they're concerned about the purity of Christianity, so therefore we don't want the establishment of Christianity. If you read anything about this debate, you read James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, written in the same context, which is oftentimes treated as an Enlightenment argument against religious establishments. But actually, Madison says the same sort of thing. He says, ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation, and the bill is adverse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity. This is James Madison in the Memorial. But even so, let me point out, again, the only thing people read, unless you come to the seminar that Paul organized, is a Memorial and Remonstrance, and we should read it, it's important. This evangelical petition was signed by about 4 times as many Virginians as signed the Memorial and Remonstrance. So in the time, it was actually far more popular, far more influential. And so where am I going with this? There's debates going on, and there's still Christians who are supporting establishments. Massachusetts has one until 1833. But I think the principle is this. We should have religious establishments if they help Christianity. But many Christians are coming to conclude that they hurt Christianity, and so we should be done away with them. And I have to say, I think that's true. And I think you can show this looking throughout the world, looking throughout history, that when governments are running churches, that never ends up well for the church, at least not over the long run. All right, let me conclude this area by turning to this wall of separation. If separationists think they know anything about the founding era, they think that, well, they probably do know Thomas Jefferson's famous letter to the Danbury Baptist, 1802, where he writes that the Establishment Clause creates a wall of separation between church and state. A wall of separation. And remember, this metaphor was picked up by Justice Black and by Justice Rutledge in 1947 as the defining metaphor of what the Establishment Clause should mean. And if this is a defining metaphor, then obviously you shouldn't have state funds going to Christian or other religious schools. You shouldn't have 10 Commandments in courthouses, and on we could go. Let me suggest, though, that there is literally no good argument that the original understanding of the Establishment Clause requires anything like this. And I'll begin by making the case with respect to Thomas Jefferson, who wanted a greater degree of separation between church and state than most Americans. All right, so Thomas Jefferson, and first of all, I should make sure this is clear. Thomas Jefferson didn't help write the First Amendment. He wasn't in America at the time. He didn't help ratify it. So why we should go to Thomas Jefferson in a letter he wrote to the Danbury Baptist in 1802 is a good question. But let's go to him anyway. When Jefferson revised Virginia's statutes, he included laws that stating when governors could appoint days for public fasting and humiliation, and also bills for punishing disturbers and worshipers of the peace. When he was governor of Virginia, he actually issued a call for prayer. And although he did not issue any as president of the United States, if you read some of his inaugural addresses, he invites his listeners to pray with them. He had an idea, Thomas Jefferson. He had a lot of ideas. In this case, I want to talk about his idea for the national seal. So there's a little committee put together in 1776. It had Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams on it. Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson wanted something like this to be our national seal. I'm sure you can make it out and you know what it is, right? It's a group of people fleeing through a river. And there's Moses with his hands up. And there's an army, Pharaoh's army, chasing these people. And God brings in the water upon Pharaoh's army. It's great symbolism, right? America is birthed in freedom. Remember, this is 1776. We're still seeking our freedom. But he wants us to be the national seal. And the motto for the United States, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So this is Thomas Jefferson, the separationist, who's proposing this for our national seal and motto. Ben Franklin, of all people, had virtually identical ideas. Only John Adams, who is in some ways more traditional Christian than those two, had classical imagery that didn't have anything to do with Christianity. We, of course, ended up going in a different direction. Now, I could give other examples, and let me make it crystal clear. Thomas Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian, and I'm not saying he wanted a close separation, close cooperation between church and state, but I am saying that even Jefferson, throughout his political career, did not act as if there was a wall of separation between church and state. And if we turn from Thomas Jefferson to the rest of the political class of Americans at the time, and we'll eventually get to that great Baptist John Leland, and he's there, even though I didn't know I was going to be using this in a Baptist church when I put this together, but we'll get to him eventually. Let's go to the first Congress, the first federal Congress. Now, if we're trying to understand the First Amendment, the first Congress is really important because it's the first federal Congress that put together the First Amendment that was then sent to the state legislatures to be ratified. This first Congress, when it came up with the final wording, the House did specifically, of what becomes the First Amendment, a guy stood up. Well, no, it's a day after. A day after the Congress came up with the final wording of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Elias Boudinot, later became the first president of the American Bible Society. He stood up, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, hey guys, things are going well. Why don't we ask President Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation? Adonias Burke of South Carolina said, oh, we can't do that. That's a European practice. Roger Sherman, that old Puritan from Connecticut, said, no, it's a biblical practice, and therefore it's fine for us to imitate. Well, the House went along with with Boudinot and Sherman. The Senate went along with the House, and they asked George Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation. Okay, there you go. These are out of order somehow, and that's my fault. Washington offers this wonderful Thanksgiving Day proclamation, 1789. I'll read just a tiny portion of it. Whereas it is a duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor, I do recommend the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was or is or will be. And he goes on to say we should also beg forgiveness for our national sins. Okay, so think about what's going on here. Congress doesn't see anything, the Congress that passed the First Amendment doesn't see anything inappropriate with asking George Washington to issue this Thanksgiving Day proclamation, and George Washington doesn't feel anything wrong with it. And I figured out why I got my slides messed up. It is my fault. So this is 1789. Fast forward to 1802. 1802, the year Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter to the Danbury Baptists where he talks about a wall of separation between church and state. Literally 2 days after he writes this letter, he goes to church services in the U.S. Capitol. Who is preaching? None other than John Leland, that great Baptist itinerant minister, who himself is an opponent of religious establishments. And that should sort of clue you in on something that's going on here. Having church services in a public building, the U.S. Capitol, he obviously did not think that was an establishment of religion. And I don't think he would consider George Washington's Thanksgiving Day proclamation an establishment of religion. What he's thinking of is like government control of churches. That's an establishment of religion. We shouldn't have those, but we don't need a wall of separation between church and state. So 2 days after Jefferson wrote this letter, he went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building. Jefferson also made the War Department building and the Treasury Department building available for church service. services. And so here's my point, my broad point. If you take an honest assessment of the founders' views of church-state relations, in no way, shape, or form did they want a wall of separation, a strict separation between church and state. They're actually completely comfortable with all sorts of cooperation between church and state, including some things that I think would be very unprudential to do today. But on the other hand, I think there's every reason to think, I know there's every reason to think, that should a state, as Texas recently did, come up with a very robust voucher system whereby parents receive vouchers that they can use at a Baptist school, a Catholic school, a Jewish school, a secular school, there is no good Establishment Clause argument against that. That is, funding schools, religious schools in this context doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. Now, we can have a debate about the policy. Is that a good policy or not? But that's simply a separate question. Now, the question I get sometimes is, well, that's fine for us Christians in America at a Christian founding, but what about non-Christians today? And we have a lot more non-Christians today. I say it's good news for them as well. All Americans can benefit from things like limited national government, separation of powers, checks and balances, but also, I think I alluded to this briefly, I argue in some detail in that Christian founding book that we embraced religious liberty in America for Christian reasons, and we understood that it applies to all Americans. And so I quote several times my favorite letter from this era. It's a wonderful letter. George Washington to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Remember I said there's about 1,500 Jews in America, and they have no economic power, no political power at this time. And he writes to this tiny minority in Newport a letter wherein he says, all citizens possess alike liberty and conscience and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that in another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. Note that same move that we saw in Virginia. We aren't talking about toleration anymore. We're talking about the inherent natural right to the free exercise of religion. And so happily, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. So a robust understanding of religious liberty for all Americans. But listen to this last paragraph. This last paragraph is beautiful. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inheritance, while they shall all sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. There are 6 to 8 allusions to Scripture in this short paragraph alone, including to Micah 4:4, that language about the vine and the fig tree. George Washington's favorite verse. And yet in none of these allusions does he put in Micah 4:4 or the other biblical citations, so Donald Lutz would have missed all of these. So the conclusion is America most certainly had a Christian founding, and this is very good news for all Americans today. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so we have time for questions, very historical. People have questions about what's going on today, so I will let others ask the questions. I could ask lots of questions, but go ahead. Things you're wondering about from the talk.
Or objections are fine as well. It's not a problem.
Yeah, thank you. So the separation of church and state that Jefferson referred to in his letter in 1802, that's the first time that reference was really used. And today it's written in the Constitution. If you were to go out on the street and start asking people, it's written in the Constitution. But in reality, that wall of separation is more like a wildlife fence along a highway here in Colorado. You can only go one direction, and it's the government that goes the other direction and gets involved in religion. Now, you referenced the sun god sacrificing a baby. Well, you know what? That goes against the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, we have other transgressions. The Mormon Church, I don't agree with it. However, they were founded on polygamy, and obviously child marriages That's, again, against life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But how can the government establish rules against polygamy? Again, not for that. I'm just saying, how can that be allowed to happen? Marriage itself. What came first, our Constitution or the institution of marriage? Okay, it's a religious institution. And yet, if I want to go get married, I have to go down to the courthouse and I have to pay the government a fee and get a piece of paper to say I'm going to be married. You know, these crazy transgressions, they're little nitpicky transgressions. And if we don't stop and block those transgressions, just like on a wildlife fence, if you don't build it right, if there's gaps in there and those animals get on the road, there's going to be collisions. And that's what we're experiencing today with all these collisions. I want to thank you for the work that you do. This is great. Really appreciate the talk.
Oh, thank you very much. And let me, so I gave you a lot of history to give you good reasons to believe that the founders didn't intend us to have a wall of separation between church and state. But this gentleman made an argument that really gets at the same point without any of the history that I gave. Think about the words of the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But a wall is a bilateral barrier, right? The image is the church is on this side, the state's on this side. The state can't interfere with the church, but also the church can't interfere with the state. But that makes no sense of the words of the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Through the 14th Amendment that now applies to states like Colorado, Colorado shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's a limitation on government only. Religious individuals and entities have all the right they want in the world to advocate for Christian values in the public square. And you called attention to some of these conflicts that we've been having and some possible solutions to them. You know, the Mormon case is interesting. You do have Mormons advocating for polygamy as a religious duty. It's not just something you get to do for fun if you want to. No, it's a religious duty. The federal government says, no, you can't do that. Utah is a federal territory, so you actually have a free exercise case that comes out of Utah. The court decides against the Mormons, but they did so for a very bad reason. They say the free exercise clause protects belief, but not action. The Mormons can believe they should have more than one wife, but the minute they act on that belief, they could be punished. But that's a lousy doctrine, because think about that. You all can believe you should share your faith in public, but once you act on that belief, we're going to arrest you. Fortunately, in 1963, William Brennan, a liberal, came up with what I think is a proper way to understand the free exercise clause. He said this: if you have a neutral law, so a law not targeting religion, that's the first thing, and this law keeps someone from acting on his or her sincere religious belief, so it is, the religious belief has to be sincere. Fortunately, courts generally defer to people. They don't try to delve into the sincerity. So that's not really all that important. But do note it has to be religious. The First Amendment does not protect philosophical belief, for instance. I think that should be protected. The founders could have adopted, they actually considered other language, talking about protecting the freedom of conscience, which would have protected both religious belief and philosophical belief, but they didn't go that way. But all that's a bit of a rabbit trail, because here's the core of the test. Okay, so let's say a law keeps me from acting on my sincere religious belief. The court's going to ask first, do we have a compelling interest, a really, really, really good interest, a good reason to keep you from acting on that religious belief? I think preventing human sacrifice, yeah, the state has that sort of interest, right? Even so, we're going to act, the state has to act in the least intrusive means possible. So there are those Christians out there, we could argue if they're Christians or not, but they call themselves Christians, First Church of Christ Science, that believe that all medical problems should be treated only by prayer, not by medicine. And when it comes to adults, I'm kind of willing to let them act on their religious convictions, I suppose. But what about children? We have had hundreds of children die from easily treatable diseases. I'm not talking about cancer that requires crazy experimental treatments, but young children with infections that could easily be cured, and the parents want to pray instead. Well, if you apply that test, I think you could say the state has a compelling, and these guys are sincere about their belief. No one doubts that. So does the state have a compelling interest in protecting innocent children from deadly diseases? I think I would say yes. Now, the state could say, okay, because we have this interest, we'll take all these children away from their parents and raise them in orphanages. But is that the least intrusive way to get at this interest? No. The least intrusive way would be to have a law requiring parents to give medical treatment to their children. And believe it or not, the Christian Scientists aren't really troubled by that. They said, well, okay, we have this view, but the law says we have to do this, and as good citizens will follow the law. And so the state intervened and saved hundreds of children who might have died, probably thousands that might have died otherwise. Yeah, so this is, I'm just trying to give you the way in which I think historically we've developed in a good way with respect to religious liberty.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any cases come up recently, maybe some that you might not be able to disclose, but just from living in Colorado, we know that it's now almost getting to the point where it's like illegal to dead name your child that's trying to, trans over, whatever.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering what you would say to that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a huge issue. Believe it or not, this will get at, I want to just shock you with a statistic. There are literally 1,241 school districts that have formal policies saying that if a child is transitioning from a girl to a boy or a boy from a girl, we will hide this from the parents. We will not tell the parents anything about it. And there are other cases, well, yeah, the one coming out of Colorado, where your great state legislature has basically said if someone comes to a counselor wanting counseling to address gender dysphoria, the counselor cannot do that. And instead, the counselor must do this sort of thing. So we're talking about compelled speech in this case. That case is being litigated to the U.S. Supreme Court on both freedom of speech grounds and free exercise of religion grounds. The current court is very good on these questions, so I think almost certainly that law will be declared unconstitutional. I think these parental preclusions policies should be declared unconstitutional on both the grounds of religious exercise, but also parental rights. Let me mention this case real quickly just for fun, because we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of it. My great state of Oregon decided in its wisdom in 1922 to ban all private schools. Can you imagine that? It banned all private schools. Now, what's going on there? Well, this is a period of profound anti-Catholic animus, and almost every private school in the state was a Catholic school. Well, this was challenged and went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1925. The U.S. Supreme Court says this law violates a parent's fundamental right to direct the education and moral upbringing of their children. This is a fundamental right that parents have. And that was 100 years ago today, and I think this right is still in existence. It's never been overturned, and that certainly it should trump these school policies where schools hide things from their parents. Just this summer, we had a case that was decided. Montgomery County, in its wisdom, decided literally to teach obscene works to 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, obscene works, making it clear you don't know what gender you are, you know what sex you are when you're born. A boy can be a girl, a girl can be a boy, 2 men can be married, LGBTQ stuff off the wazoo. Montgomery County actually had a policy saying we'll let parents pull their children from this instruction. Guess what? Too many parents started saying, we don't want you to do this to our kids. So Montgomery County, you would think Montgomery County would get a clue. Well, if it's unpopular, maybe we shouldn't do it. But these people really are ideological. They went the other direction. They say, okay, we can't give exemptions anymore. We can't allow you to pull your kids because it's too disruptive. Too many kids want to go out. This was challenged. Montgomery County is actually one of the most diverse counties. So the lead plaintiffs, interestingly enough, were Muslims, and Ethiopian Orthodox, large O Orthodox. Now think about the plaintiffs here. You won't be surprised, Ethiopian Orthodox have black skin. Muslims have brown skin. Muslims, by definition, are Muslim. And they're challenging this stuff, and this relates to the last book I wrote. And so, of course, they are called, literally, I kid you not, white Christian nationalists. These dark-skinned Muslims are white Christian nationalists, which is just ironic. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, Montgomery County, you can't indoctrinate children against their parental, the religious beliefs of their parents. That was a free exercise clause case. So the current court is going in a good direction. One of the things Paul and I do with this Religious Liberty in the States project is some states are passing laws to protect parents. To protect counselors, to ensure that they aren't forced to do things like this. And it won't surprise you, and I'm sorry to tell you all, these are the red states that are doing this. Florida and Idaho, states like that. States like Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, they're rushing in the other direction. And so, probably your best hope lies in the U.S. Supreme Court and free exercise of religion, parental rights. And again, the current court has been very good on these things. Oh, thank you.
So I'll ask a question. This would be a whole nother lecture, but could you comment a little bit about Christian nationalism? Because there's a lot of conversation around that. There's a lot of criticism of it. There's different things that are called it. So, and I know you've written on this at some length, but maybe for us as we're thinking about the political environment and things that people are saying, is Christian nationalism a thing? Is it good? Is it bad? Should we consider ourselves Christian nationalists? So if you could maybe just kind of offer 5 minutes of how you think about it, or kind of give us the landscape and how that looks maybe from a historical standpoint.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. Thank you. So basically, until 2022, no Christian in America was saying, I am a Christian nationalist. Christian nationalism is a good thing. Christian nationalism came on the scene really in about 2006, where critics, basically the same sort of critics who were critics of the moral majority, the religious right, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell. There are lots of books criticizing the religious right. These are theocrats who want to take over America for Christ and oppress non-Christians and women and that sort of thing. In 2006, the rhetoric started to change, and it became Christian nationalists want to take over America for Christ and oppress racial minorities, oppress women, oppress, of course, LGBTQ individuals, and you should be very, very, very scared. And by the way, 51.9% of Americans are Christian nationalists, either fully or partially. And so I'm reading this stuff, and I've run in crowds like this all my life. And it's like, this describes like no one I know, literally no one. Who are they talking about? So I started reading this literature, and I divided it into two camps of polemical literature. These are just activists that are making stuff up and are making ridiculous claims. And so I have a lot of fun showing why I think these are ridiculous. You have academic critics who come along, and they just make some errors. And I'm willing to say they're acting in good faith, but they make some dumb errors. Whitehead and Perry are two of the biggest scholars here, and they attempt to measure this literal toxic stew by asking a battery of questions that basically get at, do you believe in the strict separation of church and state or not? And if you believe that children going to Colorado Christian should be able to receive federal funds, if you believe that a 1925 cross now on public land to commemorate the dead men from Prince George's County doesn't need to be torn down. If you believe, if you aren't a separationist, you're a Christian nationalist, and therefore you're this horrible, racist, sexist, homophobic person. You see the move there. It's just not a good move. Now, if you are a strict separationist and you want to criticize my belief that students who choose to go to Colorado Christian should have the same access to federal aid as students who choose to go to Colorado State, that's fine. Let's argue about that. But don't just try to get away from the argument by saying you're a Christian nationalist. And so I attack all that literature. So by and large, when you see claims of Christian nationalism, I would just say, yeah, whatever. But have you ever noticed this? Sometimes when when the world is going one way, saying Christian nationalism is so bad, it's so evil, isn't it the case that some Christians are going to stand up and say, oh, wait a minute, I'm a Christian nationalist. Christian nationalism is a good thing. And this is what we saw in 2002. Doug Wilson came out and said it's salvageable. Stephen Wolfe wrote a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And now all of a sudden, all the critics feel vindicated. Look, we told you about this, and here are these guys arguing for it. Now they aren't arguing. They're very clear. We don't believe in racism. We blah, blah, blah. They disavow this. They do have some views that could be described as sexist. And I'll tell you how they get there. These guys see the family as a fundamental unit of society, not the individual. They believe that the husband is the head of the family, and therefore political representation should be through the husband. So only male men should be able to vote. Only married males should be able to vote, right? You see how that works? Now, I think you could fairly call that sexist. What I can assure you is this handful of individuals that are actually out there arguing for Christian nationalism, basically they're all idiosyncratic Calvinists connected to Doug Wilson in one way or the other. And I say this as someone very favorable towards Calvinist theology, but that's why I include idiosyncratic. This is a view, you could trace it back to Rushduni and the Theonomists and that sort of thing, but almost no Calvinist actually embraces this. But nonetheless, even though it's a tiny, tiny percentage of Christians, minuscule, I still critique it because I think it's wrong, right? I don't think you got to worry about it. I don't think there's many people. I know some of these guys personally, and they're perfectly fine people. If they live next door to you, they'd be good neighbors. But they are advocating something that I think is misbegotten, so I critique it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so here I would probably have to divide the question. The critics, literally, I can't quote it exact, but it's an ideology that's informed by racism, sexism, homophobism, militarism, that believes that Christianity should be favored above all others, and that non-Christians should be disfavored, something like that, right? So they tie up all those bad things in Christian nationalism. I actually, eventually in my book, I get around to defining what I think makes sense, a reasonable definition of Christian nationalism, and that is this. In the United States, Christian nationalists believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that today Christianity should be favored by the government above all other religions. And I have statistics on this sort of thing. So about 20% of Americans believe that Congress should formally declare America to be a Christian nation. About 28% of Americans believe that public school teachers should lead children in explicitly Christian prayers. And there's another measure along those lines. So you see what I'm getting at? These are things that do favor Christianity above all others, other religions, but they are not racist. They are not sexist. They are not even homophobic, right? Some of them would have no practical impact. What would be the impact of Congress declaring America to be a Christian nation? Some non-Christians and atheists might feel kind of left out, but really it wouldn't impact them in any clear, adverse way. Yes, if teachers led children in explicitly Christian prayers, again, some students might feel left out. By the way, that's not even what we had in the 1950s. If you go to 1962, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared teacher-led prayer to be unconstitutional, we actually only had teacher-led prayer in about half of the school districts in America, and these prayers tended to be written by government committees. Think about that. Literally, I'm not kidding you. The one in New York was written by a government committee, and I can't quote it exactly, but it's more or less like this. Oh God, please bless our day. Help us to be good and study hard. Amen. And this is America in 1962, where the vast majority of Americans are Christians, Protestants or Catholics or Jews. We don't have the ways of immigration that gives us a lot more Muslims and Hindus. But think about it. A Muslim child, a Christian child, a Jewish child could all say that prayer because it's to God, right? Not Jesus or something like that. And so frankly, I believe in prayer, absolutely. And I certainly believe that school children should have the right to gather voluntarily and pray. But I'm actually not a big fan of teachers in public schools reading government committee written prayers to children, maybe not believing in it. If they don't believe in it, they might do it in a sarcastic or cynical way. So I don't think we as Christians lost much of anything when teacher-led prayer was removed from the public schools. But let me say, you didn't ask, but I'll say this. I'm not actually a great fan of public schools. I'd like to get away from this current system and go to something like what we're seeing in Texas and elsewhere, where parents are truly empowered to send their children to schools that reflect their worldview. So send your kids to a Calvinist school, a Catholic school, a Jewish school, a secular school. I much prefer a true pluralism like that rather than a one-size-fits-all system. Yeah, this is a great point, and I do try to make distinctions. Americans are different then, just as you're different now. I think in New England, you really did have, Calvinism is far stronger. You had much greater sensitivity to fears like a British bishop being sent. In the South, the leadership of the Patriot side tended to be by Anglican gentlemen who owned debts to Great Britain, who, if we would look at them, many of them are not as personally pious as we would probably like. And I think it's accurate to say that many of them were motivated by economics. I think it's perfectly fair to say. By the late 18th century, though, we have a lot of Scotch-Irish in places like Virginia who are kind of spoiling for a fight, and I think they're motivated by other things. The common argument in the academy is that the founders were influenced by the Enlightenment, by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu, the Baron of Montesquieu. But even here, there's huge debate among political philosophers. Some political philosophers see John Locke as articulating a vision of politics that is profoundly anti-Christian, okay? Whereas other political philosophers would say, no, his vision of politics is perfectly consonant with Christianity. So you have that debate. But oftentimes people are going to want to say America's founders were influenced by a secular John Locke, by the ideals of the Enlightenment, and so they thought religion was silly. They wanted to get away with it. It's fine to be religious in your home or church, but we don't want religion in the public square. And so that's a very common argument, the most common counter argument. Someone like me has to admit that the founders quoted Montesquieu. Montesquieu is an early student of the separation of powers, but what I suggest is they were looking to Montesquieu to solve a profoundly Christian problem, the problem of sin. Humans are sinful. Even Christians continue to deal with the old man within, and therefore we want to make sure the government doesn't become tyrannical, and therefore we want to avoid concentrated powers. Oh, look, here's this guy Montesquieu who's teaching us about separation of powers and checks and balances. We can take these ideas, apply them in the American context, and use them to address a Christian problem. And let me say a word about that, by the way, because I think G.K. Chesterton called original sin like the most obvious Christian doctrine. And it's a good point. So I think you can imagine a Chinese peasant in the 9th century coming up with the idea essentially that humans are sinful. Or he'd use a Chinese word, or we could use self-interest. Yeah, so I think other cultures, other peoples can recognize that. But the question is, in America, how did the founders come to this idea? And I would suggest it was because they learned to read with works like the New England Primer that has a cute little alphabet rhyme that begins like this: A, Adam. In Adam's sin, we all fall. The New England Primer includes the entire Westminster Shorter Catechism that older students could learn how to read. 50% to 75% Calvinist. It seems to me evident that the American founders, by and large, came to the conclusion that humans were sinful because of because they were Protestants, because they were Calvinist, and this is a doctrine we teach and emphasize. One more.
I guess, do you have any theories as to why, like in modern Supreme Court history, Protestants have been so underrepresented? Like most of the, yeah, it's most
On the court. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, so it's been a little while, like 12 years, but yeah, like 12 years ago, we had something like 6 Catholics and 3 Jews on the United States Supreme Court, which is really extraordinary. So they don't detect any whiff of anti-Semitism in this, but I think it's accurate. The Jewish community has always been a community that highly values education. And as soon as Jews were freed from the sort of restrictions that they had in Europe, they were able to flourish in the American context. And very rapidly, they moved into elite positions in the American society, especially and including the academy, and the legal academy. And they're just way overrepresented. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. Back in the 40s and 50s, schools, literally the elite schools, would have limits on the numbers of Jewish students they would accept, because if they didn't have limits, you'd have too many Jews, right? They had limits on how many Jewish professors would be tenured. And so they're just so highly successful. They also tend to be politically progressive. And so when politically progressive presidents are looking around, okay, who would be a good person to appoint to the U.S. Supreme Court? Oftentimes it's someone of Jewish descent. They might not be practicing Jews themselves, but a Stephen Breyer, a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, brilliant jurists, even if you disagree with them completely. Evangelicals, this could become a lot longer of a story, broadly abandoned the life of the mind in the early 20th century. As they lost the elite schools, places like Princeton, Harvard, Yale used to be Christian. They ceased to be Christian. And so they said, the heck with this. And they left and they went off and found their own Bible academies. So many Christian colleges throughout the land were founded, and oftentimes as Bible schools and sometimes actually colleges in the 1930s. And we have these little Christian enclaves, and the idea is we've lost a culture war. Let's just focus among ourselves, not engage in culture, not really push people towards the academy. If you are a talented young man and you take your faith seriously, then obviously the thing to do is become a minister, right? What is more important than preaching the Word of God? And so evangelicals tended to go one way. Catholics have a very powerful intellectual tradition as well. Catholic schools, places like Georgetown, Notre Dame, and whatnot, and especially in matters of law, I think they cultivated the legal mind so that you had, when you're looking around for jurists, who should we appoint to this? Oh, look, there's John Roberts over there, there's Samuel Alito, there's Amy Coney Barrett. They're just simply some of the best jurists in the land, and so we went for them. In some cases, it's kind of a little, there's personal stories. Clarence Thomas, raised a Roman Catholic, left Catholicism for Protestantism, but once he got on the court, he felt drawn back to Catholicism, so he kind of returned to Catholicism. I think Neil Gorsuch is an Episcopalian. Ketanji Jackson is a Protestant of some sorts, and so it's a bit of a shift. The good news is, I think we are seeing. I think Protestants, beginning in the 1980s, you had books by Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. It kind of came to recognize, look, we cannot abandon culture. We need Protestants and all sorts of Christians represented in the elite academy, in journalism, in media, and all levels. And you're now having lots of very well-qualified Protestants. So the farm team's out there. There's good people to be appointed to seats, and there's plenty. We focus on the Supreme Court, but there are lots of excellent circuit court judges that are Protestant and Catholic. In this day and age, I'm a pretty solid Protestant, but when I get involved with religious liberty litigation, church-state stuff, man, these Catholic jurists and attorneys I work with are, they're just excellent. We're brothers and sisters, and we're working for a common cause. And the fact, I almost forget sometimes, okay, that person's a Catholic. It just doesn't matter. All right, thank you all.